And joining me now to discuss all of this are CNN political commentators Dave Jacobson, who is also a Democratic strategist, and John Thomas, who is a GOP consultant. Also with us today, CNN contributor Larry Noble, a former general counsel at the FEC. Larry, I want to start with you. Giuliani said this morning that the president probably does have the power to pardon himself, even though he did say that's not going to happen. Is that true? Can he pardon himself if he wanted to?
This is one of the serious questions we have. There are those who think he can. I'm not sure he can pardon himself. But in the past, presidents have tried to avoid this. We've tried to avoid these constitutional crises. We have three branches of government: the executive, the judiciary, and Congress, the legislative branch. It's the executive branch that enforces the law. What the president is saying is that if he can pardon himself, or if he can just cancel an investigation, end an investigation, he's above the law because the executive branch is the branch that enforces the law. So he can try to pardon himself. He can try to cancel an investigation. And then what happens? Congress can possibly impeach him. But who enforces that? He's really heading us towards a constitutional crisis that we don't want. And frankly, a democracy can't really work if people are going to constantly test the various powers and say, I'm going to use all the powers I can possibly have under the Constitution. One of the beauties of our Constitution is that it does leave open some room for growth and for disagreements, but you don't want to constantly test it.
Before I get to the other panelists, you say he is heading us toward a constitutional crisis. That's a pretty big statement to make. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we have here is testing the powers of the executive against the other branches of government. If he says, I'm going to pardon myself, if he says, I'm going to stop... And to be clear,
he hasn't said that. The memo raised the question of whether that's what they were considering. Giuliani says that's not going to happen, but go ahead.
Right, but what they're doing is they're raising the question, could he pardon himself? And if you're going to do that, and Giuliani then says, well, if he did that, he would be impeached. At that point already, you are at a point where the Constitution, you're going to the base level of the Constitution of what happens. What happens then if Congress does impeach him? What happens if Republicans decide they're not going to impeach him? Then he sits there and says, I can do anything I want because I can't be criminally prosecuted, or if I am, I can pardon myself, and nobody can do anything about it. And that is an authoritarian government at that point, and that is a constitutional crisis. Clinton worked out a deal in terms of whether he would testify. Nixon ultimately resigned. We have tried to avoid these things, and the president seems to be saying all power resides in him when it comes to his enforcing the law and his complying with the law.
And in the 20-page memo, the lawyers make this argument that the president cannot obstruct justice. Here's what a former New Jersey governor, former U.S. Attorney Chris Christie said about that.
You could tell any time that Rudy didn't agree with something, he said, you'll have to ask John about that. To go back to John Dowd, it's an outrageous claim. It's wrong. They were trying to make a broad argument. Lawyers do that all the time in briefs, even to court. And Dan and I have seen that many times happen. In the end, cooler heads prevail.
John, your reaction to that?
Yeah, the idea of Trump pardoning himself, I think, is completely ridiculous, and you could see that Giuliani even said so. That even if, and that's a big if, the legal argument held, the court of public opinion would kick Trump out of office so quickly here. And the broader obstruction argument, that is one of the key things that the Trump team is laying their hat on is, look, this guy, when the firing of Comey, was doing what was in the scope of his job. And you can't, yes, perhaps there are thin arguments to say there might be obstruction. But by and large, if you hold a president accountable criminally for things that are well within the scope of his job, it opens up a much bigger challenge for all elected officials and future presidents.
But this is something that really hasn't been tested in the courts, the obstruction statutes intersecting with what the president is allowed to do under the Constitution. And while it is within his jurisdiction under the Constitution to fire and hire whoever he wants, what about if there was corrupt intent? All of this is sort of being raised with this investigation, Dave. And it does make you wonder, as you look at the legal arguments laid out here in this 20-page memo, the broad interpretation of the Constitution, how important is it? How much weight does it carry given multiple months have passed since it was given to Mueller's team?
Well, look, I think it adds credence to the importance that we have equal branches of government, and it is incumbent upon the Congress to hold the president accountable. And if that means impeachment, then so be it. But going back to your earlier conversation about whether or not the president can pardon himself, I'm not surprised that Rudy Giuliani actually responded in the way that he did, precisely because it was Donald Trump on the campaign trail back in 2016 who said he can go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody on the street and he wouldn't lose any votes. This is a president who has the mentality that he can do no wrong. Even if it means committing a crime, perhaps he can pardon himself and rid himself of any potential prosecution.
John, do you agree with that?
No, that's absurd, Dave. His own attorney just admitted.
I'm just throwing back Donald Trump's words right back at you, John.
I understand, but his own attorney admitted that very court of public opinion would be the ones that would throw Donald Trump out of office. So
okay, really
I don't
quick,
think that theory holds.
I wanted to make sure you respond to that. I also want to get your reaction to what Giuliani said on this new development this morning. Take a listen.
I mean, this is the reason you don't let the president testify. If, you know, our recollection keeps changing, or we're not even asked a question, and somebody makes an assumption. In my case, I made an assumption. Then we corrected it, and I got it right out as soon as it happened. I think that's what happened here.
Our recollection keeps changing. Larry, is he hurting his client? What's your take on this?
I don't think he's helping his client, but he has a very difficult client. And I think one of the true things he said today is that probably all the lawyers working for Trump don't want him to testify, and Trump wants to testify. Because I think they know that it's not just a normal case when somebody testifies, they could be caught up in something, is that Trump just seems to say whatever he wants whenever it comes to his mind. And we know that he lies, that he says things that are just blatantly untrue, and he knows are untrue. So when you have a client like that, you don't want them to testify. I think Giuliani is kind of calmed down a little bit. I did think it was odd that he said that he said things when he first started that he really didn't know the facts when he was talking about a statement made in the memo that turned out not to be true. And he said, well, you know, the lawyers just get started. They don't know the facts.
Are you talking about the Stormy Daniels statement he made?
No, the statement about whether or not a Sekulow statement about whether or not Trump knew about the letter.
Dictated the statement that then in this memo it says he dictate, even though Jay Sekulow said he didn't. Okay, wanted to clarify. Yeah.
Right, and so originally Sekulow said that the president didn't have any involvement with that. Now he's saying that, yes, in fact, he did dictate it. And Giuliani's response to that is that, well, you know, lawyers say things early on when they get involved in a case, and they don't necessarily know the facts. I don't know that to be true. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. I don't go out there and say things about my client, factual statements when I haven't talked to my client and I don't know the facts. So that seems to be bizarre and is not helping the president.
Yeah, and on 5 occasions, Jay Sekulow and Sarah Sanders said that he did not dictate. Now in this memo it says he did. All right, Larry Noble, Dave Jacobson, John Thomas, stick around. More to discuss. Do appreciate your input.